The dust was a living thing, a fine red ghost that haunted the air and settled in the folds of a man's soul. It clung to Ethan Cole's worn duster, coated the brim of his hat, and grit the back of his teeth with the taste of absence. He rode through the single, sorry street of redemption, a town that had long since forgotten the meaning of its own name. It was a place of last chances and final endings, and Ethan felt himself suspended somewhere between the two. The sun was a hammer, beating down on the cracked earth and the warped timber of the buildings, bleaching the world of all colors save for the pale, unforgiving glare of the sky. 4 or 5 years, this had been his existence, a circuit of weary labor on his isolated ranch, punctuated by these necessary trips into a world he no longer felt a part of. 5 years since the raid, since the screams had been swallowed by the night, and the fire had taken everything but the memory of smoke and the hollow echo of his own failure. He tied his horse to the hitching post outside the general store, the leather of the reins smooth and familiar in his calloused hands. It was the small, physical things that kept him tethered to the present. The heft of an axe, the pull of a water bucket from the well, the solid weight of the colt at his hip. Everything else was vapor, the spectral shapes of his wife, Maria, and his daughter, Sarah. Sarah, her name was a shard of glass in his throat. He saw her in the flight of a sparrow, in the wild daisies that grew stubbornly by the creek, in the small, empty chair that still sat by the hearth. They had taken her. Comancheros, they'd said, lost to the brutal trade that fed on the innocent. He had tracked them until the trail went cold and his hope had turned to ash, a slow-burning ember of grief that now served as the only warmth in his life. He was turning from the post when he heard it. Not a shout, but a muffled cry of distress, thin and sharp as a needle. Across the street, by the shadowed alley beside the saloon, 2 men were manhandling a girl. She was small, no older than Sarah would have been now, with straight black hair that fell in a tangled curtain over her face. Her dress was torn, her feet bare and dusty. Apache, he knew instantly from the fine beadwork on the frayed hem of her garment. She fought with a silent, desperate ferocity, twisting and kicking, but the men were large, their grips cruel and absolute. One of them, a thick-necked brute with a sweat-stained shirt, laughed a low, guttural sound that curdled the hot air. The other, leaner and with a rat-like face, hissed something at her, his voice a venomous whisper. Ethan's world narrowed to that single, terrible tableau. The men's faces were vaguely familiar, low-level scum who drifted in and out of towns like this, always in the orbit of a more significant evil. Beaumont. The name surfaced in his mind like a bloated corpse. Jedediah Beaumont, a trafficker whose cruelty was a whispered legend across the territory. He dealt in anything that could be bought or stolen, livestock, guns, people, especially children. An old instinct, cold and dead for years, stirred in Ethan's gut. Turn away. This is not your fight. Trouble finds the man who goes looking for it. His own life was proof of that. He had built a life, a family, a home, and in one night of fire and violence, it had been erased. Solitude was his penance and his shield. To interfere now would be to invite that chaos back into the fragile peace he had constructed from his own ruin. But then the girl stumbled, and for a fleeting second, her face turned toward him. In her wide, dark eyes, he saw not just fear, but a defiant flame that had not yet been extinguished. And in that moment, she was not a stranger. She was Sarah being dragged away into the darkness. The same terror, the same helplessness, the same world that stood by and did nothing. The ghost of his daughter's stolen future rose up and screamed in the silent chambers of his heart. The dust swirled at his feet, and the sun beat down, but Ethan no longer felt the heat. All he felt was the icy grip of a choice he had already made. His hand, resting loosely near the worn grip of his pistol, did not tremble. The part of him that had died 5 years ago had just been given a reason to draw one more breath, to fight one more time. He started across the street, his stride measured and deliberate, each step an answer to a prayer he'd forgotten he knew how to pray. The 2 men didn't notice him at first. too consumed by their task. The alley was a tight channel of shadow, smelling of stale whiskey and decay. The girl, Iona, though he did not yet know her name, had gone limp, a calculated stillness that seemed to unnerve her captors more than her struggles had. The lean one shook her. "Get up. Beaumont's waiting." Ethan's voice was low, rusty from disuse, but it cut through the oppressive heat like a shard of ice. "Let her go," they turned, startled. Their expressions shifted from annoyance to contempt as they took in the lone figure standing at the mouth of the alley. They saw a man etched with sun and sorrow, his clothes practical and patched, his face a mask of weary resignation. They saw a rancher, not a threat. The thick-necked one smirked, showing a row of yellow teeth. "This ain't your concern, old man." Right on. Ethan's gaze did not waver. It rested on the girl, then moved to the hand gripping her arm. "I said," he repeated, his voice dropping even lower, gaining a dangerous weight. "Let her go." The lean one, emboldened by his partner's confidence, took a step forward. "Or what? You gonna talk us to death?" A flicker of movement. That's all it was. Ethan's hand was no longer at his side. The barrel of the Colt was level, steady, an extension of his will. The air in the alley thickened, growing heavy and still. The smirk vanished from the first man's face, replaced by a sudden, dawning comprehension. The weariness in Ethan's eyes was not surrender. It was the profound exhaustion of a man who had seen the worst of the world and was no longer afraid of it. "I'm only going to say it once more," Ethan said. The words were quiet, almost gentle, yet they carried the finality of a closing grave. The thick-necked man, slower to grasp the shift in power, made his mistake. He let go of the girl and reached for the pistol tucked into his own belt. He was fast, but his speed was born of bravado. Ethan's was born of memory. The gunshot was a deafening crack in the tight space, a brutal punctuation mark. The man grunted, a look of profound surprise on his face as a dark stain blossomed on his chest. He staggered back, hit the brick wall, and slid down to the filthy ground, leaving a wet smear behind him. The lean one froze, his hand hovering over his own weapon, his eyes wide with disbelief and terror. He stared at his fallen partner, then at the smoking barrel of Ethan's Colt. The girl used the moment of distraction. She drove her elbow back into the man's stomach, a sharp, savage blow. He gasped, doubling over, and she scrambled away from him, moving toward Ethan with the instinct of a creature seeking higher ground. She stopped behind him, her small hand gripping the back of his duster. The man straightened up, his face a contorted mask of rage and fear. "You're a dead man," he spat. "Beaumont will hear about this. He'll hunt you down and—" Ethan didn't let him finish. He didn't want to hear the threats. He didn't want to hear the name. He just wanted the silence back. He cocked the hammer of the Colt, the sound clicking through the alley with chilling clarity. "Drop it," Ethan commanded. The man's eyes darted around, searching for an escape that didn't exist. Slowly, with trembling fingers, he unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall into the dust. "Now get out of here and tell Beaumont. Tell him Ethan Cole is waiting." It was a foolish thing to say, a name given to a shadow, a challenge thrown into the wind. But the name had to be spoken. It was his own, and in using it, he was reclaiming something more than just his voice. The man, needing no further encouragement, turned and fled, stumbling out of the alley and disappearing down the street. The sudden quiet was more jarring than the violence. The only sound were Ethan's own breathing and the soft, ragged gasps of the girl behind him. He stood for a long moment, the pistol still raised, before the tension finally drained from his shoulders. He lowered the gun, the weight of it suddenly immense. He looked down at the dead man, at the pooling blood soaking into the thirsty ground. He felt nothing. Not remorse, not satisfaction. Just a vast, cold emptiness. He turned to the girl. She looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his face. She was no longer just a symbol of his own loss. She was real, frightened but alive. He could see the bruises forming on her arms, a cut on her cheek. He holstered his pistol and gestured with his head toward the street. "Come on." He didn't know where they were going. He only knew they could not stay here. He untied his horse, his movements stiff, and automatic. The girl watched him, her expression unreadable. He expected her to run, to melt back into the wilderness she came from. Instead, she stood her ground, a small, silent sentinel. He mounted his horse, then looked down at her. He offered a hand. She hesitated for only a heartbeat before taking it. Her hand was small and surprisingly strong. He pulled her up, settling her in front of him on the saddle. She was light, barely a presence against him, but her warmth was a stark contrast to the cold that had lived inside him for so long. He turned the horse away from the town of Redemption and spurred it toward the open plains, toward the lonely silhouette of his ranch. He was riding into the very storm he had spent 5 years avoiding, with a ghost from his past at his back and a living, breathing promise of a future he didn't want held tight in his arms. The ride to the ranch was a long, silent passage through a landscape that mirrored Ethan's own soul, vast, empty, and weathered by harsh elements. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple, the colors of a fresh bruise. The girl, Iona, sat stiffly in front of him, her small frame held rigid, a coiled spring of watchfulness. She did not speak, and he did not press her. Words were a currency he had long since run out of, and he suspected she had her own reasons for hoarding them. He could feel the fine tremor that ran through her, the lingering shock of her ordeal. He imagined she was sizing him up, this grim stranger who had appeared out of the dust, dealing death with a quiet finality before sweeping her into another unknown. He couldn't blame her. Trust was a fragile bloom in this hard country, easily crushed under the heel of experience. As they crested the last rise, the ranch came into view. It wasn't much. A small, sturdy cabin hewn from local timber, a barn leaning with age, and a web of corrals, all huddled together as if for comfort against the immense, indifferent expanse of the plains. To a stranger, it was a lonely, desolate place. To Ethan, it was a fortress of memory. Every plank and post was saturated with the past. That was the spot where Maria had planted her small garden of herbs, their scent a ghost on the evening breeze. There was the porch swing he'd built, where he and Sarah had counted constellations on clear summer nights. The silence here was different from the silence of the wilderness. It was heavier, filled with the echoes of laughter and conversation that no longer existed. This was the sanctuary he had built to contain his grief, and now he was bringing the world back into it. He dismounted and gently lifted her down. Her feet touched the ground, and she immediately took a step back, putting distance between them. Her eyes darted around, assessing the cabin, the barn, the horizon, cataloging every detail, every potential threat, every possible escape route. She moved with the fluid caution of a deer that had wandered into a hunter's camp. He saw the intelligence in her gaze, the survivor's instinct that had kept her alive this far. "You're safe here," he said, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. He wasn't sure if she understood his language, or if she simply chose not to acknowledge it. He led his horse to the trough, the rhythmic creak of the pump handle the only sound breaking the stillness. Iona watched him from the porch, a small, unmoving shadow in the encroaching twilight. She did not try to run. She seemed to be waiting, observing, making a decision he was not privy to. Inside the cabin, the air was cool and smelled of wood smoke and solitude. A fire lay dormant in the stone hearth. A simple table with 2 chairs stood in the center of the room. A single cot was against one wall, his bedroll a tight cylinder beside it. It was a space stripped down to a man's basic needs, with no room for comfort or sentimentality, except for the ghosts he could not evict. He lit a lantern, and the small room filled with a soft, golden light that seemed to push the vast darkness outside back a few inches. He gestured for her to sit at the table, but she remained by the door, her back pressed against the rough-hewn wood. He understood. The door was her escape. He didn't push. Instead, he moved to the small pantry, taking out a strip of dry jerky and a tin cup. He filled the cup with water from the bucket by the door and placed both items on the corner of the table closest to her. He then retreated to the other side of the room, giving her space, turning his attention to cleaning his pistol, a task that was both necessary and meditative. He worked in silence, the metallic clicks of the cylinder and hammer precise and comforting. He felt her eyes on him, studying his hands, his face, the deliberate economy of his movements. He risked a glance at her. She hadn't moved, but her gaze had shifted to the food and water on the table. He saw the flicker of hunger and thirst warring with her caution. Slowly, after what felt like an eternity, she slid away from the door and approached the table. She didn't sit. She picked up the cup with one hand and the jerky with the other, her movements swift and furtive, and retreated back to her post by the door. She drank the water in long, deep swallows, her throat working. Then she began to chew on the tough jerky, her small jaw working methodically. It was not a surrender, but a temporary truce, a concession to the body's demands. Ethan finished cleaning his weapon and set it aside. He took a damp cloth and approached her slowly, as one would approach a skittish colt. He stopped a few feet away and held out the cloth. "You're hurt," he said softly, nodding toward the cut on her cheek. She flinched when he moved, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. But she didn't bolt. She watched his face, her gaze intense, searching for any sign of deception. He held his expression neutral, his posture non-threatening. After a long, silent moment, she gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. He stepped closer and gently dabbed at the cut, cleaning away the dried blood and dust. Her skin was warm beneath his rough fingers. For a moment, the simple, caring act was so reminiscent of tending to Sarah's scraped knees and bruised elbows that a wave of grief, sharp and debilitating, washed over him. He drew his hand back quickly, his composure threatening to crack. He retreated to the hearth, turning his back to her, and began to build a fire, focusing on the simple, mechanical task of stacking the kindling and striking a match. He needed the fire, not just for warmth against the coming night chill, but as a barrier against the memories she had so unwittingly stirred. Behind him, he heard a soft rustling. When the first flames began to lick at the wood, he turned. She had moved from the door and had curled up on the small rag rug in front of the hearth, her head resting on her knees. She had chosen the fire over the exit. It was the first sign, a flicker of trust, as small and fragile as the new flame he had just brought to life. Days bled into one another, measured not by the calendar, but by the slow, cautious rhythm of two solitary people learning to share the same space. A fragile trust began to sprout in the barren soil of their shared silence, a thing nurtured not by words, but by deeds. Ethan rose with the sun, the habit of a lifetime, and would find Iona already awake, a small, still figure watching the dawn paint the eastern plains. She was a creature of the light, seeming to draw strength from its rising. He would work his chores, mending fences, tending to his 2 horses, chopping wood, and she would watch. Always watching. Her observation was not idle. It was a form of learning, of understanding the man who had wrenched her from one fate and delivered her to another. He never gave her orders, never told her what to do. He simply went about his life, and slowly, tentatively, she began to enter it. It started with the chickens. He had a small coop with a half-dozen hens, their clucking a small, domestic sound in the vast quiet. One morning, as he was scattering feed, he saw her standing by the coop, her head tilted. He finished and left the small feed sack by the fence post. The next morning, when he came out, the chickens had already been fed. He saw her small footprints in the dust around the coop. He said nothing, but a current of understanding passed between them. It became her task. Another day, he was mending a tear in a saddle blanket, his large, clumsy fingers struggling with a needle and thread. He grew frustrated, the simple task magnified by his grief into another symbol of his own inadequacy. He set it down with a sigh and walked away to check a fence line. When he returned an hour later, the blanket was lying on the porch railing, the tears sealed with a line of small, neat stitches that put his own efforts to shame. He looked toward the cabin and saw her shadow move away from the window. The most significant change happened at the dinner table. For days, she had taken her food and retreated to her spot by the hearth or the door. Then one evening, As he sat eating a stew of rabbit and wild vegetables, she pulled out the other chair and sat down opposite him. The space between them, once a chasm, was now just a few feet of worn wood. They ate in their customary silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was companionable, a shared quiet rather than a mutual defense. He found himself studying her as she had studied him. He saw the intelligence in her quick, observant eyes, the resilience in the set of her small jaw. She was not broken by what had happened to her. She was wounded, yes, but underneath the fear, a core of tempered steel remained. One evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls, she spoke for the first time. He was carving a piece of scrap wood, an old habit to keep his hands busy. He wasn't making anything in particular, just letting the knife find a shape in the grain. "Iona," she said. Her voice was soft, clear, and stronger than he'd expected. He stopped carving and looked up at her. She tapped her chest lightly with her fingers. "Iona." Then she pointed at him. He was taken aback, having grown so accustomed to their silent communication. "Ethan," he replied, his own voice sounding loud in the quiet room. "My name is Ethan," she nodded, testing the name on her tongue in a whisper he couldn't quite hear. A name exchanged. It was a simple thing, yet it felt monumental. It was an acknowledgement that they were no longer just a man and a girl, a rescuer and a victim. They were Ethan and Iona. And in that moment, sitting in the warm glow of the firelight, Ethan felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in 5 years. It wasn't happiness, not yet. It was something more fundamental. It was connection. The feeling was terrifying. It made him vulnerable. It reminded him of everything he had lost, of the family that used to sit in this very room, their presence so vivid he could almost hear his wife humming, see his daughter playing with her dolls by the fire. He looked down at the piece of wood in his hands and saw that, without thinking, his knife had begun to shape the familiar form of a small bird. He had carved dozens of them for Sarah. He quickly put the wood and the knife away, the ghost of that memory too sharp, too painful. But the connection, once made, could not be so easily dismissed. He looked across the table at Iona, at this young girl who had been thrust into his life, and he understood a terrible, unavoidable truth. He had not just saved her from Beaumont's men. He had tethered her fate to his own. Beaumont was not a man to forget a slight or a loss of property. The man he had let go would have carried his name back like a disease. The peace of his ranch was an illusion, a temporary reprieve before a storm he had knowingly invited. He had not just brought a girl into his sanctuary. He had brought the world, with all its attendant violence, to his door. And looking at her, he knew he would not, could not, let that storm touch her. The thaw in their relationship had brought with it the chilling certainty of a coming frost. The peace was a fragile membrane, and it was torn by the sight of a lone rider silhouetted against the morning sun. Ethan spotted him from the barn, a dark speck on the distant eastern ridge, too far to be identified, but too deliberate in his stillness to be a lost traveler. The rider sat there for a long time, an ominous sentinel simply watching the ranch, before turning and melting back over the horizon. It was a message. "We know where you are." The air on the ranch, which had begun to feel lighter, grew heavy again, charged with a familiar metallic tension. Ethan's solitude had been a shield, but now his isolation was a liability. There were no neighbors to call on, no law to summon. The only barrier between this place and whatever Beaumont decided to send was him. And now Iona. He found her by the creek, washing the tin plates from their morning meal. She saw the change in him immediately, the way his shoulders had tensed, the hard set of his jaw. Her hands stilled in the water, and she looked up at him, her dark eyes asking the question she wouldn't speak. He didn't need words. He pointed toward the ridge where the rider had been. "Beaumont," he said, the name a curse on his lips. Her expression didn't shift to fear, not in the way he expected. There was no panic, no tears. Instead, a grim understanding settled over her features. She had been living with this threat for far longer than he had. This was not a new storm for her, just a familiar one that had found her again. She dried the plates on a cloth, her movements precise and economical, and followed him back to the cabin. The time for quiet observation was over. The time for preparation had begun. He laid out his arsenal on the table. The Colt, a Winchester rifle, and a heavy, double-barreled shotgun. He also had a box of ammunition for each. It was a pitifully small collection against a man like Beaumont, who likely commanded a dozen men or more. They couldn't hope to win a straight fight. Their only chance was the land itself. "We can't stay in the cabin," he said, thinking aloud as much as speaking to her. "It's a box. A trap." She listened, her gaze moving from the weapons to his face. He walked to the door and looked out toward the west, where the plains gave way to a tumble of rock and shallow canyons. It was rough country, a maze of stone and shadow he knew as well as the lines on his own hand. "The canyon," he said, a plan beginning to form in his mind. "We make our stand there." He took a piece of charcoal from the hearth and, on a wide, smooth plank of wood, began to sketch a crude map. He drew the ranch, the creek, and the winding path that led into the mouth of the canyon. He drew the narrow passages, the high ledges, the rock falls that could be turned into traps. As he drew, he explained his thinking in short, clipped sentences. "A rock slide here can block the main path. They'll have to come through the narrows 1 by 1 inch. He pointed to another spot. "A good place for the rifle. High ground." He looked at her to see if she was following. She leaned over the plank, her brow furrowed in concentration. Then, she picked up a smaller piece of charcoal. She didn't draw on his map. Instead, she turned the plank over and began her own drawing. Her map was different. It was less about lines and more about features. She drew the shape of a distinctive rock outcropping he had overlooked, a place that offered concealed cover. She drew a line indicating a game trail, barely visible to an untrained eye, that would allow them to move between 2 key positions without being seen. She added symbols for stands of dense brush and areas of loose shale that would make a stealthy approach impossible for their pursuers. He stared at her drawing, a sense of awe quieting his own rough certainty. He knew the land as a rancher, as a man who owned it. She knew it as a creature who lived within it. Her knowledge was older, more intimate. She saw its secrets, its teeth. Their 2 maps, his and hers, together formed a complete picture, a strategy born of 2 different worlds, 2 different kinds of wisdom. "Good," he said, the single word carrying the weight of his respect. "That's good." They spent the rest of the day in a fever of activity, no longer a man and a girl, but a single unit with a shared purpose. They packed supplies, water, dried meat, ammunition. He showed her how to load and fire the Winchester. He expected her to be hesitant, perhaps frightened of the weapon's power. But she handled it with a steady, solemn competence, her small shoulder braced to take the recoil. She learned quickly, her movements efficient, her focus absolute. As they worked, a new dynamic formed between them. The fragile dependency she'd had on him was being forged into a partnership. He was the strength, the firepower. She was the eyes, the knowledge of the earth, the silent strategist who saw the hidden paths. They were 2 broken pieces of a hard world, fitting themselves together to form a barrier against the coming tide. That evening, as they made their final preparations, the sky began to cloud over. A low, rumbling thunder echoed from the distant mountains, a harbinger of the storm to come. The wind picked up, rustling the dry grasses, whispering through the eaves of the cabin like a mournful ghost. The world outside was mirroring the tempest they were preparing to face. They were ready, or as ready as they could ever be. The land around the ranch was their ally, a silent partner in the desperate strategy they had devised. In the gray, pre-dawn light, they began to set their traps, their movements economical and synchronized, a testament to the unspoken understanding that now flowed between them. They worked not with the frantic energy of fear, but with the cold, deliberate focus of survivors. Their first task was the rock slide Ethan had planned. High on the canyon wall, a massive overhang of loose rock and scree loomed over the main trail. For an hour, they worked with a long, sturdy pole, leveraging it against key rocks, disturbing the delicate balance that nature had maintained for centuries. It was grueling work, their muscles straining, their breath coming in ragged plumes in the cool air. Finally, with a deep groan that seemed to rise from the very bones of the mountain, the pile shifted. It was ready. A single, well-placed push would send tons of rock and earth cascading down, sealing the canyon's wide mouth and forcing any pursuers into the narrow, treacherous passages they had chosen for the fight. Next, they moved to the game trail Iona had identified. It was a slender artery running along the canyon's spine, a hidden highway that would allow them to outmaneuver a larger force. Together, they cleared small obstructions, ensuring silent passage. Iona pointed out a hollow beneath an ancient juniper tree, its roots gnarled and exposed. It was a perfect cache. There, they stashed their spare water and ammunition, a lifeline for a protracted fight. She showed him how to use handfuls of dust and crushed leaves to obscure their tracks leading to the spot, a simple trick that rendered their preparations nearly invisible. She moved with a quiet confidence in this wild terrain, her small form navigating the rocks and brush with an innate grace he could only envy. He was an intruder here, imposing his will on the land. She was a part of it, reading its language, respecting its power. He watched her pile a small cairn of stones, not as a marker for herself, but as a subtle warning of a patch of loose shale, a natural trap for a loud and clumsy man. Her contributions were not just additive. They were transformative, turning his blunt plan into a nuanced and deadly defense. As the morning wore on, they worked their way deeper into the canyon. He showed her how to rig a simple tripwire using a vine and a cluster of dry branches tied to a loose rock. It wouldn't kill anyone, but the clatter would echo through the canyon, an alarm bell in the quiet. She, in turn, showed him how to bend a young sapling and rig a snare that would catch a man's foot, a disorienting and painful surprise. They were a strange pair, the grizzled, world-weary rancher with his knowledge of firearms and blunt force, and the young Apache girl with her ancient, intimate understanding of the land's subtle weaponry. His strength was in the loud, final report of a rifle. Hers was in the silent snap of a twig, the rustle of a leaf that signaled danger. They fortified the rifle nest he had chosen, a high ledge that commanded a view of the main kill zone. They piled rocks into a low wall, just high enough for cover. From here, the Winchester could control the narrow passage below. It was a lonely, exposed position, and he knew it would be his. He planned for Iona to be further back, a spotter, a support. But as she helped him place the final rocks, she looked at the position, then at the rifle, and then at him. Her gaze was steady, unwavering. There was no question in it, only a statement. We fight together. The unspoken declaration hung in the air between them. He had rescued her to keep her safe, to honor the memory of the daughter he had failed to protect. But she was not a passive victim to be hidden away. She was a warrior in her own right, forged in a fire he could only imagine. To deny her a role in her own defense would be to disrespect the very strength he had come to admire. He gave a slow, solemn nod. The partnership was sealed not in words, but in that shared look of grim resolve on a lonely, windswept ledge. As they finished their work, a quiet descended, the calm before the inevitable violence. They had done all they could. The canyon was no longer just a feature of the landscape. They had turned it into an extension of their will, a weapon waiting to be wielded. Every stone, every shadow, every twist in the path was now part of their design. They had forged their fortress not from wood and steel, but from rock, knowledge, and a shared desperation. The sun reached its zenith and began its slow decline, casting long, distorted shadows that crept across the canyon floor like dark fingers. The air grew still, pregnant with anticipation. Ethan and Iona took up their position on the high ledge, the world spread out below them like a map of their own making. From this vantage point, they could see the trail leading from the ranch, a dusty ribbon winding through the sagebrush. They sat in silence, backs against the rock wall they had built, the Winchester lying across Ethan's lap. The waiting was its own kind of battle, a war waged against the ghosts of the mind. In the oppressive quiet, Ethan's thoughts drifted back, as they always did, to that other night of waiting. The night of the raid. He remembered the smell of rain on the dry earth, the sound of Maria singing a lullaby to Sarah, the feeling of absolute peace that had settled over their small home. It was the memory of that peace that made its shattering so unbearable. He had been a fool, content and complacent, blind to the darkness that circled just beyond the firelight. He had failed to see the signs, failed to protect them. The guilt was a physical weight, a stone in his gut that had been there for 5 long years. He glanced at Iona. She sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the trail, her patience a thing of deep, ancient practice. She seemed to feel his gaze and turned her head. Her dark eyes were full of a quiet understanding, as if she could see the phantoms that haunted him. He felt a sudden, sharp need to explain, to give voice to the failure that defined him. "I had a daughter," he said, his voice rough, breaking the long silence. "Her name was Sarah." Iona did not look away. She listened, her attention absolute. She was about your age. Blonde hair, eyes the color of a summer sky. She was everything. He paused, the words catching in his throat. He hadn't spoken of her to another living soul since it happened. To say her name aloud felt like both a betrayal and a sacrament. The men who came, they were like Beaumont's men, riding for plunder. They wanted horses, guns. They took what they wanted. His voice grew quiet, turning inward. "I fought. I thought I was strong enough. But there were too many. They killed Maria, my wife. And they took Sarah." He looked down at his hands, seeing not the callous skin of a rancher, but the hands of a man who had been unable to hold on to what he loved most. "I tracked them for weeks. Lost the trail in the Badlands. I never saw her again. Sometimes I think it would have been a mercy if they'd killed her too. The things men like that do." He couldn't finish the thought. It was a darkness too profound to articulate. He fell silent, the confession hanging in the air, raw and bleeding. He had not said it for sympathy or for forgiveness. He had said it because he needed her to understand that this fight was not just about her. It was his chance to face the same specter of evil that had destroyed his world, to answer its violence not with fear, but with resolve. He reached into his duster pocket and pulled out the small, half-finished wooden bird. The wood was smooth from his constant, unconscious touch. He held it out to her on his open palm. She looked at the bird, then at his face. Her expression was one of profound solemnity. She didn't take it. Instead, she reached out with one small finger and gently touched the carved wing, a gesture of reverence, of acknowledgement. It was enough. The touch was a bridge across their separate griefs. In that moment, he wasn't just a broken man haunted by his past, and she wasn't just a lost girl. They were two people who understood the terrible cost of this world, bound together by a shared determination that it would not claim them. A flicker of movement on the horizon snapped them back to the present. A dust cloud, small at first, but growing steadily. Riders. They were coming. Ethan's hand closed around the wooden bird, then returned it to his pocket. The time for ghosts was over. He picked up the Winchester, the cold, hard reality of the rifle a welcome anchor. He checked the chamber, the action smooth and sure. He looked at Iona. Her face was calm, her eyes sharp and focused. All the vulnerability he had seen in her in that alleyway in Redemption was gone, burned away by a fierce, quiet resolve. She was ready. He settled into position behind the low rock wall, resting the rifle barrel on the stones, sighting down the long, empty trail. The storm was no longer coming. It was here. The riders emerged from the heat haze, a dozen of them, a ragged collection of hard men moving with the lazy confidence of predators who believe their prey is cornered. They were led by a man on a big black horse, a man who sat his saddle with an air of proprietary arrogance. Even from this distance, Ethan knew it was Beaumont. The name itself felt like a poison. They rode directly for the ranch, their casual approach a testament to their contempt. They would expect to find him holed up in the cabin, a rat in a box. They would not be expecting a canyon that had been turned into a gauntlet. Ethan and Iona watched them surround the cabin, their voices carrying faintly on the wind. There were shouts, then the splintering sound of the cabin door being kicked in. A few moments of silence. Then they re-emerged, their frustration palpable even from afar. One of them pointed to the tracks leading toward the canyon. The trap was set. Beaumont conferred with his men, then gestured for them to follow the trail. They entered the canyon's mouth in a tight group, their horses picking their way over the rocky ground. Ethan took a slow, deep breath, the air tasting of dust and ozone. He glanced at Iona. She gave a single, sharp nod. It was time. He sighted on the key stone in the rock pile high above them, the one they had so painstakingly loosened. He squeezed the trigger. The Winchester's report was a deafening crack that shattered the silence, the bullet whining through the air. It struck the rock with a sharp ping, a sound immediately swallowed by a deep, terrifying groan. The overhang gave way. Tons of rock, dirt, and splintered wood cascaded down into the canyon mouth, a thundering avalanche of earth. A plume of dust erupted, thick and choking. The path was gone, sealed by a mountain of debris. Panic erupted below. Horses screamed and reared, their riders fighting for control in the sudden chaos. Beaumont's shouts were sharp, angry commands, tried to impose order on the pandemonium. They were trapped. Their only way forward was through the narrow passages, just as he and Iona had planned. Now, Ethan whispered, and they slipped away from the ledge down the game trail, moving toward the first ambush point. They reached the tripwire just as two of Beaumont's men, dismounted and advancing cautiously on foot, were approaching. They were moving loudly, their boots scraping on the stone, their curses echoing in the confined space. They hit the vine. The clatter of the dried branches and the falling rock was shockingly loud. Both men flinched, spinning around, rifles raised. It was the distraction Ethan needed. From his concealed position behind a rockfall, he fired the Winchester. The first man went down with a cry, clutching his leg. The second dove for cover, firing blindly in the direction of the sound. Ethan worked the lever action, the brass casing ejecting with a sharp metallic sound. Beside him, Iona was a silent shadow, her eyes scanning the rocks above and behind them, watching their backs. She pointed. Another man was trying to circle around them from a higher position. Ethan shifted his aim, firing a shot that ricocheted off the rock near the man's head, forcing him back into cover. The canyon had become a deadly echo chamber, the gunshots bouncing off the rock walls, making it impossible for Beaumont's men to pinpoint their location. They were fighting ghosts. They retreated back up the game trail, their movements swift and silent, circling ahead of their pursuers. They took up a new position near the sapling snare Iona had set. They didn't have to wait long. Another of Beaumont's men, moving too quickly, his focus on the rocks ahead, stepped right into it. The sapling whipped back, the vine tightening around his ankle, yanking his leg out from under him. He fell hard with a grunt of pain and surprise, his rifle clattering on the stones. Before he could recover, Ethan was on him, the butt of his Winchester striking the man's temple with a sickening thud. The fight was brutal and ugly, a series of short, violent encounters. Ethan and Iona moved through the canyon like phantoms, striking and fading back into the shadows. They used every trick, every piece of knowledge they had. Iona would dislodge a single stone, drawing fire to one location while Ethan opened up from another. They worked in perfect concert, a seamless blend of his firepower and her cunning. Two more of Beaumont's men fell, one to a bullet, another losing his footing on the loose shale Iona had marked and taking a bad fall. The initial group of a dozen was being whittled down, their confidence shattered, replaced by fear and confusion. But Beaumont was still out there. Ethan could hear his voice, a furious bellow, trying to rally his terrified men. He knew this skirmishing wouldn't last. Eventually, Beaumont would consolidate his remaining force and push through, hunting them down with grim determination. This had to end. It had to end with Beaumont. Ethan looked at Iona, her face smudged with dirt, her eyes bright with adrenaline. He pointed toward the heart of the canyon, a small, open basin surrounded by sheer rock walls. A natural arena. He then pointed to himself. He had to draw Beaumont out, face him directly. This was his fight, his demon to exorcise. Iona understood immediately. She shook her head, a sharp, fierce gesture. She would not leave him. He put a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm. Iona, he said, his voice low and urgent. This one is for me. For Sarah. He gave her the Winchester. Cover me. From the high rocks. Just like we planned. He saw the conflict in her eyes, the fierce loyalty warring with her understanding of his purpose. After a long moment, she gave a slow, reluctant nod. She took the rifle, its weight familiar in her hands now, and melted back into the shadows, beginning the climb to the overlook they had prepared. Ethan took a deep breath, holstered his Colt, and stepped out into the open. The floor of the small basin was covered in gravel that crunched under Ethan's boots. He stood in the center, exposed, a solitary figure against the towering rock walls. The shadows were long now, the air growing cool. He waited, his senses stretched taut, listening to the scuff of boots, the dislodged pebbles that signaled the approach of the remaining men. First, two of them appeared at the narrow entrance to the basin, rifles held ready. They saw him standing alone and hesitated, suspicious of the obvious trap. Then, Beaumont himself strode into view, shoving them aside. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, with a thick beard and cold, predatory eyes. He exuded an aura of brutal authority. He stopped 30 feet from Ethan, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "Ethan Cole," he said, his voice a low growl. "The ghost of Red Creek. I heard you crawled into a hole after they took your family. Looks like you found a new one to get killed over." The words were meant to be barbs, to wound and unbalance him. But they had no effect. The pain Beaumont spoke of was an old companion, its edges worn smooth with time. Ethan's own grief was a shield the man's taunts could not penetrate. "The girl is not your property, Beaumont," Ethan said, his voice even. "Let her go. You and your men ride out of this canyon. And you live," Beaumont laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed off the rocks. "You're in no position to be making offers, Cole. Look around you." He gestured to his men, who were fanning out, their rifles trained on Ethan. "I have a dozen guns. You had a dozen guns," Ethan corrected him calmly. "Some of them aren't feeling so well." Beaumont's smile faltered. He scanned the silent, empty cliffs that surrounded them. The confidence in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of unease. He couldn't see Iona, but he could feel the presence of another threat. "So, the little Apache bitch has some bite. Does she? Doesn't matter. Once I'm done with you, I'll find her. And I'll take my time teaching her some manners." That was it. That was the line. A cold, clear rage, pure and absolute, rose in Ethan. It wasn't the hot, blinding anger of his youth. It was a focused, glacial fury. "This is between you and me, Beaumont," Ethan said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Just you and me." Beaumont considered it for a moment, his eyes darting between Ethan and the cliffs. He was a man who enjoyed his own legend, who believed in his own strength. To have his men gun down a single opponent was efficient, but it lacked style. He wanted to break this man himself. "All right, Cole," he sneered, pulling a large, bone-handled knife from his belt. "You and me." He tossed the knife, and it landed in the dirt halfway between them. "No guns. Let's see what kind of man you really are." His men lowered their rifles, their expressions a mix of anticipation and bloodlust. Ethan unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall to the ground. He walked forward and picked up the heavy knife, its weight unfamiliar in his hand. He preferred the finality of a gun, the distance it afforded. This was something else. This was personal. Beaumont charged, moving with a surprising speed for a man his size. He didn't fight with skill or finesse. He fought like a bear, with brute force and overpowering momentum. He crashed into Ethan, and the two men went down in a tangle of limbs, wrestling in the gravel. Beaumont was stronger, his hands like vices. He clawed for Ethan's eyes, for his throat. Ethan twisted away, the sharp rocks digging into his back. He brought the knife up, slashing at Beaumont's arm, opening a long, shallow gash. Beaumont roared in pain and fury, rolling off him. They scrambled to their feet, circling each other, their breathing harsh and ragged. Blood dripped from Beaumont's arm onto the dusty ground. His face was a mask of feral rage. He lunged again, and this time Ethan was ready. He sidestepped, bringing the butt of the knife handle down hard on Beaumont's wrist. The trafficker cried out as his hand went numb, but he used his momentum to drive a shoulder into Ethan's chest, sending him staggering back. From the cliffs above, a shot rang out, not at Beaumont, but at the ground near one of his men who had started to raise his rifle. The man jumped back as if stung, looking up in terror at the unseen shooter. It was the signal. Iona was watching. She was holding them to their word. Beaumont glanced up, his distraction giving Ethan the opening he needed. He drove forward, low and hard, tackling Beaumont at the waist. They fell again, and this time Ethan was on top. He pinned Beaumont's good arm with his knee and raised a knife. He looked down into the man's hateful, furious eyes. In that moment, he saw the faces of all the men from that night 5 years ago. He saw the embodiment of the senseless, greedy cruelty that had shattered his life. All the grief, all the rage, all the helplessness he had carried for so long coalesced into a single point of cold, lethal intent. He could end it. He could drive the blade home and repay a fraction of the pain he had been dealt. But as he looked into Beaumont's eyes, he didn't see a monster. He saw a pathetic, desperate man, cornered and afraid. To kill him like this, in a moment of passion, would be to let the man's own darkness poison him. He thought of Sarah. He thought of Iona. He was fighting for them, not for revenge. He slammed Beaumont's head against the rocky ground, once, twice. The man's eyes rolled back, and he went limp. Ethan rose, his body aching, his knuckles raw. He stood over the unconscious form of Jedediah Beaumont, the knife still in his hand. The remaining men stared at him, their bravado gone, replaced by a sullen fear. Ethan looked up at the cliffs, toward the spot where he knew Iona was watching. He had won, but the victory felt hollow, leaving only the bitter taste of violence and exhaustion. The silence that fell over the canyon was profound, broken only by Ethan's own ragged breathing and the distant whisper of the wind. Beaumont's men, their leader defeated, seemed to shrink into themselves. Their bluster had been a reflection of his own, and with him unconscious on the ground, they were just a handful of beaten men, leaderless and lost. They looked at Ethan, then at the silent, watchful cliffs, and seemed to make a collective, unspoken decision. Without a word, they began to back away, retrieving their stunned and injured companions. They gathered Beaumont's unconscious form, slinging him over a horse like a sack of grain. Their retreat was clumsy and ignominious. Ethan watched them go, making no move to stop them. Their power was broken. The threat was over. He stood there until the last sound of their horses faded, leaving him alone in the arena of his reckoning. The adrenaline drained away, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and the throbbing ache of a dozen bruises. He looked down at the knife in his hand, its blade stained with Beaumont's blood. He let it fall from his fingers, the clatter against the rocks a sound of finality. He had faced his demon and had not become him. A small figure appeared at the edge of the basin. Iona. She walked toward him, the Winchester held loosely in her hands. She stopped in front of him, her dark eyes searching his face, taking in the cuts, the bruises, the exhaustion etched into his features. She said nothing, but her presence was a balm, a quiet affirmation that he was not alone. He had not fought for nothing. As if summoned by the stillness, a new group of riders appeared, materializing from the shadows of the canyon with a silence that spoke of deep familiarity with the land. They were Apache. At their head was a man with a weathered face and eyes that held the same quiet intensity as Iona's. He dismounted, his movements fluid and dignified. Iona ran to him, a single, soft cry escaping her lips. "Father!" The man enveloped her in his arms, his stern expression melting into one of profound relief. He held her for a long moment, stroking her hair, his eyes closed. He then looked over her head at Ethan, his gaze sweeping over the scene, the discarded weapons, the blood on the ground, the weary man standing before him. He released Iona and walked toward Ethan. He stopped, and for a moment, the two men simply looked at each other, a silent communication passing between them. The Apache leader, whose name Ethan would learn was DeSoto, saw not a white man, an enemy, but the man who had brought his daughter back from the brink. Ethan saw not a savage, but a father whose love and fear mirrored his own. DeSoto raised a hand and placed it on Ethan's shoulder. "You have my thanks," he said, his English heavily accented but clear. The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of an immense debt. "She is my only child. My heart, I know," Ethan said, his voice hoarse. And he did. He knew better than any man what it was to have your heart walking outside your body, vulnerable to the cruelties of the world. Iona came to stand beside her father. She looked at Ethan, and a small, sad smile touched her lips. She reached into the pouch at her belt and pulled out the small, half-carved wooden bird he had shown her. She pressed it into his hand, her small fingers closing his own around it. It was not a return, but a gift. A symbol of a debt repaid, a memory honored. It meant your fight for your daughter is over. You can rest now. Tears pricked at the corners of Ethan's eyes, the first he had shed in 5 long years. He looked at the bird, then at the girl, and finally at the father. He gave a single, solemn nod of acknowledgement. Without further ceremony, DeSoto and his men helped Iona onto a horse. She looked back at Ethan one last time, her expression a complex mixture of gratitude, respect, and farewell. Then they turned and rode away, their forms melting back into the landscape as silently as they had appeared. Ethan was alone again. He walked slowly back to his ranch, each step an effort. The cabin door hung broken on its hinges. Inside, the place was ransacked, a testament to the violation. But as he stood in the doorway, the setting sun casting a long, golden light across the floor, the place no longer felt haunted. The ghosts were still there, the memories of Maria and Sarah, but their presence was no longer a source of pain. It was a source of strength. The silence was not the silence of emptiness, but of peace. He had not gotten his daughter back. He had not undone the past, but he had faced it. He had stood his ground. He had protected an innocent, and in doing so had protected the last, best part of himself. He looked out at the vast, empty plains, the same landscape that had once seemed like a prison of his own making. Now it looked different. It looked like a beginning. The world was still a hard and dangerous place, but he was no longer just a ghost drifting through it. He was Ethan Cole. He was a man who had found a reason to fight, a reason to live, a connection to a world he thought had left him behind. He was not alone, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt the quiet, resilient stirrings of hope.